I remember the first time I truly noticed how heavy rest could feel. It was Saturday afternoon. The sun glanced softly through the kitchen window, birds chirping quietly outside. I had planned to spend the weekend doing nothing, just letting myself unwind. But as soon as I sank into the couch, a familiar tension crept in, twisting deep inside my chest. Instead of comfort, I felt a sudden surge of unease, like I'd broken some invisible rule. Rest wasn't peace. It was a slope toward failure, a door to guilt. I fidgeted, convinced that every second I spent idle was stealing something essential from my worth. That moment was like a mirror held up to my daily battle, a battle that many of us carry quietly within. For me, resting didn't bring relief, it brought a storm. My mind screamed that I should be doing more, producing more, achieving more. The tranquil pause I craved turned into a pit of anxiety where every breath felt measured against the unspoken standard of usefulness. It felt as if the clock was judging me with the harshest condemnation. Anytime I stopped, I was losing. Losing time, potential, respect, maybe even myself. I wasn't lazy. Far from it. I was someone who believed deeply in earning my worth through relentless action. From early morning to late at night, I moved like a machine, desperate to hold on to control, to prove that I mattered. Yet, paradoxically, the harder I tried to outrun my nervousness, the more it clung to me, tightening its grip whenever I slowed down. Rest, instead of being a sanctuary, felt like an outlaw territory where my fears ran wild. One night, after tossing and turning well past midnight, I whispered to myself, "Why does doing nothing feel like guilt?" The question lingered in the quiet darkness long after, heavy and unresolved. I sensed there was more beneath this restless surface, a tangled web of thoughts and feelings I hadn't yet dared to unravel. That's when I realized how deeply anxiety had rewired the way I saw rest. It wasn't just about my thoughts or mood. It was something wired into the way I valued myself. Productivity wasn't simply a habit. It was a currency of self-worth. To pause was to risk judgment from others and, more hauntingly, from myself. This wasn't just a story about me. I knew I wasn't alone in this experience. I'd heard from countless others who felt caught in the same exhausting trap. The craving for calm that came with a side of guilt, the compulsion to constantly justify every break, the haunting worry that if they stopped, they'd be left behind. Sometimes, this shadow of anxiety disguised itself as motivation. But more often, it whispered a warning. Rest is a danger zone, a betrayal of progress. Even now, as I sit here reflecting and writing, that old fear is not entirely gone. The urge to fill every moment with purpose hums quietly just beneath the surface. But there's also something different happening, a soft opening to curiosity, to understanding these invisible forces within me. What if rest wasn't the enemy? What if this tension didn't have to define my relationship with stillness? I want to invite you into this inner journey with me. Not a lecture, not quick fixes, but a clear-eyed look at what's really happening when we try to rest while anxiety is running wild. Together, we'll explore the invisible threads that tie anxiety to guilt around rest, the feelings that confuse relaxation with failure, the fears that whisper, "You're falling behind," and the exhausting need to justify every pause. We'll shine light on the silent battles playing out inside us, the ways our minds turn what should be soothing into a source of stress. This isn't about demanding more from ourselves or shifting burdens. It's about uncovering truths, fragments of understanding that have been buried beneath years of tension and fear. It's about recognizing that rest isn't a prize we earn only after proving ourselves. It's a deep biological necessity, one our anxious minds struggle to honor. As you read these words, maybe you're already familiar with this restless guilt. Maybe you feel it right now in your body or your thoughts. That tight knot that insists you're only worth something if you're busy, if you're producing, if you're moving. I see you. I sit with you. And I want to walk this path together, gently uncovering the layers that keep us stuck and opening room for something just a little bit different. Because in the middle of that struggle, I found out something crucial. Resting isn't giving up. It's not a betrayal. It's a way to sustain the life we want to live, the energy we need to grow, and the peace we deserve. Maybe, slowly, we can learn to rest not with guilt, but with grace. Maybe we can create a new story about what it means to pause, to breathe, and to simply be. There was a particular moment I recall vividly, one that exposed a hidden corner of my mind where anxiety and self-expectations collide. I had set aside an entire afternoon, determined to take a break without any obligations pressing on me. Yet, as I sat quietly, an unexpected tension spread across my shoulders and settled deep within my chest. My thoughts raced, weaving a narrative that freezing my activity felt like squandering a rare, fleeting opportunity. It was as if my identity depended entirely on constant motion, and any pause threatened to dismantle the delicate scaffolding I'd built over years. In that confined space of inner turmoil, I realized how much of this pressure came from an almost invisible dialogue with control. The need to grip every moment tightly, to dominate time itself, had become a silent commander within me. What captivated me the most was how this urge didn't express itself overtly as fear or panic. Instead, it wore a mask of urgent productivity, relentless and demanding. That desire to maintain command masked deeper roots: fear of unpredictability, apprehension about vulnerability, the dread of losing ground in a world that feels like a race without finish line. At that point, I started paying attention to the subtle ways this inner critic influenced not just my thoughts, but my body's responses. Whenever stillness appeared, my heartbeat quickened even if I tried to breathe calmly. Muscles tightened involuntarily. In a strange way, my entire physiology seemed wired to signal that inactivity was a red flag, a cue that danger was near. As if ancient survival mechanisms kicked in, alerting me to a threat that only my mind could manufacture. The peril of slipping behind, of being unworthy without visible achievement. Attempting to rationalize this, I found an intriguing pattern: the incessant comparison with an imagined standard that never stops evolving. It wasn't about measurable goals alone. I realized it was more insidious. The mind scrutinizes every resting moment against an ever-shifting backdrop of what could be done better or how much I'm falling behind, creating a mental threadbare tapestry of discontent. What struck me was how exhausting this internal yardstick was. It never grants pause, never offers kindness. It's like an invisible scoreboard constantly flashing losses, where quiet moments are scored as zeros or, worse, negatives. One evening, while journaling these reflections, a phrase emerged without my conscious effort. Silence is loud when it carries expectation. That distilled the paradox perfectly. The stillness I craved was invaded by an internal voice that clung to urgency and achievement like a lifeline, transforming silence into clamor. Hearing it written down was like finally seeing a mirage for what it was, an illusion constructed by relentless inner demands. I shared this insight with a close friend, and their response widened my perspective even further. "Have you noticed," they asked gently, "how you treat moments of quiet not as time to recharge, but as a test? A personal exam where failure means shame." Their words hit home hard. It became clear that beyond anxiety's usual grasp lay this constant pressure to perform, even at the edges of stillness. The pauses weren't breaks, but checkpoints marked by internal surveillance, where I wasn't allowed to breathe freely because I feared falling out of favor with myself. This conversation planted a seed that grew into a crucial understanding. The resistance to stepping off the treadmill isn't merely about fear of wasted time, but a fear of losing identity. When our self-image is entangled with persistent output, releasing the grip on action feels like losing ourselves. I found myself thinking about a dancer bound by invisible strings, every movement choreographed to meet relentless demands, unable to surrender fully to the music of rest without fearing collapse. Releasing this tension requires more than willpower. It demands cultivating an inner sanctuary where safety isn't earned but given unconditionally. I realized that escaping the trap meant reprogramming the nervous system, inviting it to trust the quiet, allowing space for stillness to coexist with value. Achieving this isn't instantaneous. It's akin to teaching a wild bird to land softly, coaxing it to let wings fold without panic. Now, consider how this applies when you confront moments bereft of external tasks: a weekend, an evening without deadlines. The impulse to fill silence with productivity may beat loudly against your ribcage. Yet, beneath that urgency lies an invitation to meet vulnerability not with judgment but compassion. Seeking refuge in stillness doesn't erode worth. Instead, it can deepen resilience. I remember experimenting with this myself, introducing tiny intentional pauses between activities, framing them not as downtime, but as acts of self-respect. At first, the discomfort was almost unbearable. My mind protested fiercely, but gradually, those moments became anchors in my day, pulling me into a rhythm where demand ebbed into calm. They taught me that acceptance of rest isn't passivity, but an act of rebellion against relentless expectation. This journey revealed an unexpected ally within, the curiosity to observe without criticism. When anxiety whispers that relaxation signals failure, curiosity can interrupt. It asks, what if moments of calm are the groundwork for all that follows? What if allowing myself to breathe fully is the most productive move I can make? Embracing these questions turned abyss into possibility. I want you to feel encouraged to experiment with this. Notice how your body reacts when you carve out space free of agendas. Observe the thoughts that arise and meet them with questions, not condemnation. The dynamic between anxiety and moments of pause is complex, but our relationship with it can evolve. We can learn to create internal environments where stillness doesn't trigger alarm bells, but rings peace bells, where life's tempo includes intervals of grace. As I continue to navigate this intricate dance, I hold on to a fragile but growing belief. Allowing rest and calm to coexist with ambition and action is not contradictory. It's the heart's quiet revolution, reclaiming balance amid the storm. And from that balance, all kinds of renewal become possible. The first time I recognized how deeply my mind resisted quiet moments was during a brief pause at work. I had finished a key task earlier than expected, and, instead of moving immediately to the next, I chose to sit silently for 5 minutes. Almost instantly, a creeping unease grew, like tiny embers igniting beneath my skin. My thoughts spiraled. How much am I losing by halting now? Who will notice if I seem less driven? Am I disappointing others or myself? It was as if pausing triggered a loud internal alarm, convincing me that surrendering to stillness equated to failure, even if momentary. I remember catching myself gripping the edge of the chair, my fingers tightening, reflecting a body bracing for impact. Rather than calming, that short break amplified my heartbeat, squeezed my chest, and left me restless despite inactivity. That morning illumination revealed a startling reality. My nervous system had become conditioned to equate every interruption with lack of discipline or laziness. I wasn't simply uncomfortable. I was biologically wired to interpret ceasefire as peril. Later, during a conversation with a therapist, she mentioned something that surprised me. She said anxiety often hijacks how we perceive safety, tricking us into believing productivity guarantees security. What stood out was the idea that this wasn't just psychological trickery. It was a learned survival tactic embedded in our autonomic responses. This insight reframed my struggle. Understanding it as a reflex instead of a character flaw offered a new doorway beyond judgment. Then, more layers surfaced. I began noticing the subtle ways I weaponized my efficiency against myself. Each day, I built defenses around busyness. If I slowed, my mind launched accusatory narratives about lost chances or missed meaning. I collected evidence to prove to myself that only through constant exertion did I remain valuable or vital. It was a self-enforced prison where every ceasing step echoed with whispers of inadequacy. But the saddest part was this. Despite all that effort, fatigue amassed like shadowed fog, thick and stubborn, smothering moments of genuine vitality. One afternoon, while walking without purpose, deliberately stripping my schedule bare, I caught a glimpse of a child playing without care or agenda. Her laughter spilled easily, her motions unburdened, like a melody not forced but naturally flowing. Watching her stirred a bittersweet blend of envy and longing inside me. Could I reclaim such unrefined ease without that gnawing sensation of guilt? What if joy didn't demand achievement as its price? I couldn't shake the image of that carefree child, so I tried an experiment. At home, after a long week of deadlines and obligations, I dimmed the lights, sank into a favorite chair, and resisted any urge to ruminate over tasks undone. Initially, the stillness felt alien. My mind raced with "you should be planning," or "what's next?" But gradually, I shifted focus to the sensations, The softness of the chair, the warmth flickering from the lamp, the faint hum of night outside. Curiosity and presence pride open a small crack of calm. During those suspended moments, I recalled something a mentor once said: the body archives emotional experiences through physical tension. So when we ignore the body's signals that scream for pause, tension cements deeper. This made me acknowledge how many times I'd overridden my body's messages, mistaking rest as indulgence instead of necessity. I realized an honest pause demands not only stilling the mind, but softening the body, untensing the shoulders, unclenching the jaw, inviting breath to expand naturally. An unexpected wave of compassion rose up then, like a gentle tide washing away fibers of self-reproach. I embraced that letting go did not signal weakness or lesser identity. It was an essential act of care, a reclaiming of my humanity. My thoughts shifted. Might embracing unstructured moments permit new perspectives, creativity, and balance? Could releasing control over constant action restore energy, not squander it? The next weekend, I confronted another trial. The urge to fill every silent instant with something edible for my anxiety. Scrolling phones, organizing closets, even cleaning thoroughly. I stopped myself and asked, what do you fear will happen if you sit quietly? The answer emerged: a sense of invisibility, insignificance. That fear, raw and unsettling, illuminated how much my self-worth had depended on visible milestones. Yet, simultaneously, this awareness offered power. Naming the fear allowed me to confront it directly rather than be hijacked unknowingly. Slowly, as I nurtured moments of pause, a new internal narrative began humming beneath the surface. I am enough regardless of output. My presence, simply as myself, carries inherent value beyond any measurement. This process wasn't linear or spotless. On many occasions, the old reflex to rush or prove surged back with full force. But my ability to notice and embrace the discomfort without surrendering to panic grew stronger. With each encounter, I built an inner resilience founded on gentleness, authenticity, and patience. It felt less like battling an adversary and more like welcoming an estranged part of myself home. Now, consider how this applies when you face a blank evening or unexpected free hours. You might find your mind racing to fill silence, dissecting the scarcity of achievement. But inviting curiosity about that discomfort rather than resisting it can transform the experience. Listening to your body's cues, experimenting with softening tension, and welcoming vulnerability, as fragile as it feels, can reveal new pathways to wholeness far beyond mere productivity. I've come to understand that these moments of self-connection, though uneasy at first, become fertile ground for reweaving our inner fabric where worth and rest coexist naturally. We learn that allowing ourselves pauses is not a surrender to chaos, but a brave invitation to truly inhabit life's nuanced rhythms. I recall a day not long ago when exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. The moments between tasks stretched endlessly, and yet instead of relief, my mind churned with escalating tension. It struck me then that the source of my unrest wasn't simply busyness, but the underlying stories I told myself about worthiness and control. Unpacking those stories, I discovered a hidden mechanism at play: the belief that uninterrupted striving was the only proof I had of existing meaningfully. This realization acted like a crack in the fortress built around relentless effort, allowing me to glimpse something uncharted beneath the surface. One afternoon, I found myself sitting by a window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. Without intention, I began tracing their paths, observing their meandering journeys from top to bottom. It was strangely soothing, a quiet ballet disconnected from anxiety's usual clamor. For the first time in a long while, I entertained the possibility that brief disengagement wasn't inherently suspicious or threatening. Rather, these small, seemingly insignificant pauses could offer a secret doorway into forgotten parts of myself, layers untouched by urgency or self-judgment. My cat, usually a symbol of carefree leisure, became an unexpected tutor on that day. As she stretched and curled lazily in the sunlight, I noticed something profound. Her rest was unapologetic, natural, and free of excuse. There was no mental monologue undermining her stillness, no need to prove her belonging through accomplishment. That contrast jolted me. Her body and spirit aligned in effortless harmony, while mine hovered on edge, demanding constant proof of progress. This observation planted a seed of curiosity. Could I reclaim some fraction of that authentic ease without compromising my drive? Later, I experimented with a small rebellion. I set aside 15 minutes purely for being. No planning, no organizing, just unstructured presence. The initial invasion of doubt was fierce. Is this productive? Am I wasting time? What will others think? Yet, as I persisted, a subtle shift unfolded. My breathing deepened. The background noise of expectations dimmed to a whisper. In that margin of untethered time, I encountered an unexpected guest, tenderness. A softness toward my own vulnerability revealed itself gently, like dawn breaking through dense fog. Tenderness brought with it acceptance, not as a vague ideal, but a visceral experience grounding me amid internal storms. A friend once shared a metaphor that resonated with this experience. Resting isn't a detour from the path. It's the root system quietly nourishing the tree's ability to reach skyward. It reframed rest from an interruption of action to a foundational process sustaining growth. That image helped me shift my perspective away from shame and toward reverence for those still moments. After all, what good is endless motion if the ground beneath crumbles? This understanding made me realize that honoring natural rhythms, including times of stillness, enhances rather than diminishes potential. One night, walking through a quiet neighborhood under a blanket of stars, I felt the weight of accumulated expectations lift just enough for clarity to seep in. The constellations, distant and steady, had no need for validation. They simply existed in grace and dignity. It dawned on me how deeply I intertwined feeling worthwhile with proving worth externally, and how exhausting that tether had become. Could I choose instead to embody the silent strength of stars, shining steadily without performance? Facing these reflections invited me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Part of the guilt tied to pausing stems from a fear of invisibility, not simply to others, but to ourselves. In moments of rest, that fear whispers lies, urging me to fill silence with productivity or justify breaks endlessly. But what if invisibility in this sense is not void or failure, but a precious, necessary space for integration and healing? What if yielding to quietness gently reclaims energies fragmented by constant resistance? Through these encounters, I began composing a new internal dialogue, one that recognized rest as an intentional act of courage. It involved choosing to stand with discomfort rather than bolt, to meet rest not as an adversary, but as a countertop where resilience is needed and shaped. The shift was subtle yet profound. By surrendering the impulse to prove continuously, I discovered an expansive freedom that paradoxically enriched my capacity to engage fully afterwards. Perhaps you've noticed, too, the peculiar hunger that stirs in rest's absence, a craving not just for inertia but for integration. Rest offers a canvas to weave scattered threads of thought, emotion, and energy into coherent patterns. Without this weaving, our experience is fragmented, prone to unraveling under pressure. I invite you now to picture rest as a loom where the fabric of your inner life is repaired, strengthened, and beautified, even if these moments feel vulnerable or unfamiliar at first. The path ahead isn't about eliminating drive or dismissing ambition. It's about balancing the rhythm of effort and ease with mindful intention. This balance is a dance, sometimes faltering, sometimes flowing, with rest as an essential partner, not a passive bystander. My own journey continues, marked by trials and breakthroughs, but now illuminated by the awareness that sustained vitality depends on embracing the full spectrum of experience, including quiet moments that feel precarious yet promise renewal. In those spaces between action, I find invitations to deepen presence, cultivate curiosity about discomfort, and nurture an internal safety net woven from compassion and truth. It's here I learn that rest, far from being a thief of value, is the very source from which sufficiency and wholeness arise. There was a particular evening I found myself trapped in a loop of restlessness that felt impossible to break. I had returned home early, untouched by any immediate obligation, yet my mind refused to grant permission to relax. Instead, It circled the notion that every idle minute carved into my potential, leaving me hollow. I paced between the living room and kitchen, my breath shallow, searching for an activity that could anchor me. Even turning on music or opening a book seemed like half measures, inadequate attempts to justify my stillness. My partner noticed my agitation and finally asked, "What's going on? You look unsettled." I confessed that the idea of simply being without achievement felt foreign, almost dangerous. They listened without judgment, then suggested something neither of us expected. "Let's just sit together, no plans, no talking, just presence." Hesitant but curious, I agreed. We sank into the worn couch, side by side, silence filling the space. At first, my mind darted, fists clenched internally, but as minutes passed, the air between us softened. Without distraction, my body gradually eased out of armor I hadn't realized I wore so tightly. That evening revealed a discovery I hadn't anticipated. The shared stillness didn't demand anything from me, no hidden performance to evaluate. It wasn't an arena for proving worth or productivity. It was acceptance in its purest form. The vulnerability of that surrender, instead of stirring anxiety, began to dissolve its edges. I started to understand that certain environments can cultivate safety that individual effort alone might never summon. Connection can create a bridge that supports the hesitant steps into rest. Another milestone emerged during a morning hike through dense woods nearby. The path curved upward sluggishly, roots weaving through the earth like ancient veins. As I climbed, my heartbeat quickened, muscles protested, yet the temptation to push relentlessly dimmed. Instead, I slowed, absorbing the tapestry of moss and bark, the crisp scent of pine, intertwining with each mindful inhale. Contrary to my usual impulses, I allowed myself to pause at intervals, not out of defeat or lack of discipline, but intentional appreciation. Those intentional breaks transformed from tokens of weakness into intentional gifts to my body and spirit. What struck me was the contrast between this experience and the patterned urgency that usually ruled my approach to movement and rest. Instead of measuring worth through endurance or output, I began to recognize the grace that comes when I honor natural rhythms. Rest, I realized, isn't an enemy of effort. It's a symbiotic partner, a pause that enriches the quality and sustainability of movement forward. This hike, steep and challenging, illustrated how integrating pace variation can foster resilience rather than depletion. Later that week, sitting by a small fire pit, I pondered the cycles I'd witnessed in nature, flames flickering, consuming fuel, then shifting to embers radiating warmth and light without burning brightly. Similarly, my days need to oscillate between high energy and gentle glow. The fire's rhythm whispered truths I needed to hear. Rest is less about absence and more about transformation, about lighting parts of ourselves that yearn for steady warmth rather than fierce blaze. These insights stirred tension within me. Questioning years of equating self-esteem solely with constant activity wasn't comfortable. There was resistance, a faint clamor from deep inside labeling these softer powers unproductive or dangerous. Yet, leaning into those sensations, I cultivated a language of self-kindness unfamiliar before. It was less about conquering weakness and more about befriending fragility, a tender, necessary courage. One afternoon, I shared my reflections with a colleague during a break. They smiled knowingly and said, "I think society trains us to applaud speed and visible success, but overlooks the quiet strength that comes from stillness and patience." Their words felt like a balm, affirming that my experience wasn't isolated weakness, but a universal tension many carry under polished exteriors. This conversation expanded my understanding that what I'd mistaken for a personal flaw was, in reality, a shared cultural struggle. Reflecting further, I realized that allowing restorative pauses without self-judgment demands more than intention. It requires rewriting core beliefs about identity and value. It's akin to learning a new language, where the vocabulary shifts from "I must perform" to "I am enough as I am." This transformation unfolds gradually, through countless small acts where I choose compassion over criticism, presence over performance. Now, imagine confronting your own moments when the impulse to rush or overexert seizes hold. I invite you to consider what emotions and stories rise in response. Is there a voice inside that equates inactivity with worthlessness? What would happen if, instead, you treated periods of rest as essential chapters in your personal narrative, sections that prepare and empower rather than hinder and diminish? These moments of reflection aren't about sudden perfection, but about small, brave steps forging a healthier relationship with yourself. The path includes acknowledging fear while also extending patience. It involves recognizing that allowing ourselves grace and stillness fosters not only healing, but also the stamina to engage with life more deeply over time. Each time I choose to embrace that pace, I take a little more ownership of my well-being and dismantle the invisible walls anxiety has erected. What at first seems fragile often reveals itself as profound strength, the kind that rises quietly, unwavering, beneath the surface roar. This strength invites us all to rest differently, to live not as slaves to constant doing, but as architects of balanced, meaningful existence. One afternoon, I found myself caught in a restless loop, pacing through my apartment as the sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. My mind was relentless, throwing images of unfinished tasks and to-do lists across my thoughts, each one demanding immediate attention. Yet, in the quiet of that moment, I sensed something deeper churning, a persistent discomfort I struggled to name. The pause I craved seemed elusive, as if trapped behind an invisible barrier woven from invisible threads of expectation and fear. On impulse, I opened a journal tucked away on a dusty shelf and began to write without restraint. The words surfaced unbidden, like whispers emerging from a well I hadn't dared to explore. What if I am allowed to rest without judgment? What if stillness isn't a mistake, but a form of courage? Pen trembling, I startled myself by admitting the depth of my resistance to unstructured time. This reflective act marked a turning point, a recognition that my aversion to rest was tangled in layers far beyond productivity or time management. Later, I sought refuge in my neighborhood park, choosing a secluded bench beneath a towering oak. The breeze carried the scent of earth and new leaves, mingling with distant children's laughter. As I sat, I noticed the symphony unfolding all around, the delicate flutter of squirrels scampering, the buzz of bees weaving through blossoms, tinny birdsong weaving a canopy of sound. In that moment, I became deeply aware of a discord inside me, a tension that demanded constant movement, yet felt at odds with the natural cadence pulsing outside. That sparked a vivid metaphor swirling in my mind. Life as an ocean, waves rising and crashing, then receding into calm depths. I realized my own rhythm had been more like a relentless storm, unending swells threatening to overwhelm the shore. What if I could invite myself to be the ocean's surface, embracing both intensity and rest, turbulence and tranquility? This image softened a rigid expectation I clung to and invited a tenderness not accustomed to being extended towards myself. One evening, during a rare respite, my best friend called. We spoke candidly about the pressure we both wrestled with, the constant internal jury measuring every idle moment. It's exhausting, she confessed. Like I have to apologize for just existing in calm. Her voice, raw yet courageous, connected with a vulnerable part of me often silenced by stress. Our shared confession expanded my perspective. I realized this wasn't an isolated burden, but a collective struggle stitched into modern life's fabric. That conversation propelled me to experiment with what I later called permission pauses. These weren't scheduled antics or productivity hacks, but deliberate, guilt-free moments to exist fully without purpose. I practiced sitting in my backyard at dusk, watching twilight obscure familiar shapes. Initially, my thoughts churned with every possible task should be done by now, but I learned to nod at these urges without submission, returning instead to the subtle play of shadows and shifting light. In time, these permission pauses became sanctuaries amid daily urgency, frames of restoration that invited a profound internal whisper. My worth did not hinge on achievement. This subtle, tender voice grew stronger with each embrace of rest, dismantling old barricades built from fear of judgment, failure, or invisibility. The act of allowing myself to simply be became a radical form of self-kindness, a reclamation of sovereignty over my own time and mind. One particularly vivid afternoon, I sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor, holding a warm cup of tea, eyes closed, tuning into sensations without words or goals. Instead of fleeing from discomfort, I allowed a quiet watchfulness. I felt trapped by an invisible cage barely perceived, a prison of mental narratives about worth tied to output. Simultaneously, each breath seemed to loosen a strand of this cage, as if inviting freedom through presence rather than action. Reflecting on these moments led me to appreciate that the resistance against rest often masquerades as a protective armor woven from stories of survival. These stories once kept me safe in challenging circumstances, but now bound me tightly to unrelenting expectations. Acknowledging their origins allowed empathy to enter the space where harsh self-criticism had held court for too long. I want you to imagine yourself standing at a crossroads, facing a path labeled constant doing and another, less defined, marked embrace of stillness. Neither is easy to travel, but the latter offers a promise of renewed energy and clarity. When anxiety grips you in those in-between moments, inviting curiosity about what fuels your restlessness can open a window. Ask, what am I truly guarding against? What might I discover if I lean, not away, but into uncertainty? Each day presents opportunities for these discoveries. What initially feels foreign and uncomfortable can, with patience, reveal itself as a source of inner richness and resilience. Cultivating this relationship with rest requires ongoing courage, a willingness to meet vulnerability without recoil. Stillness becomes not a void but a wellspring where strength quietly grows, nurtured by the very breaths once thought wasted. In this evolving journey, I've learned that the space to pause belongs within the territory of growth. We aren't called to relentless action but to mindful movement, flowing between motion and rest with intention, honoring the nuanced interplay of our needs. This subtle dance liberates us from the false decree that productivity equates to value, inviting instead an expansive recognition that dwelling fully in any moment, even one framed by rest, is an act of profound living. Reflecting on this journey so far, I notice how the threads of my experience weave into a tapestry both intricate and alive, vibrant with tension and tenderness. It feels as if I have been walking along a winding river, sometimes rushing with urgency, sometimes flowing with a surprising softness. And through this movement, I have glimpsed the subtle currents that shape not just my days, but my very sense of self. What strikes me most is how elusive stillness can be when framed by unspoken demands, as if the quiet holds a language I've only just begun to hear. I remember a moment when I paused at the edge of a forest path, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth, and realized the depth of the grip that relentless doing had on me. The trees did not dash or strain but stood firm in their place, absorbing seasons with patience I had long forgotten to afford myself. In their quiet strength, I sensed an invitation, an unspoken challenge to lower my defenses and meet rest not as an adversary, but as a wise guide. It was as if I stood on the brink of something vast yet intimate, a terrain that asked me to surrender habitual patterns without surrendering my core. What surprises me still is how often I equate motion with identity and stillness with invisibility. It is as if being seen depends entirely on the visible marks I leave in the world, the measurable gestures of achievement, the proofs of effort that I parade before my own eyes first. Yet, the more I chase this mirage, the more fatigue settles deep, an unyielding companion that whispers an alternate truth. Vitality is renewed not by constant conquest, but by the ebb and flow of engagement and release. In this way, rest reveals itself not as a pause in the story, but a quiet folding of chapters, moments that shape meaning beneath the crescendo. At times, I wonder if my resistance to genuine pause arises from a fear of undoing the very narrative I have worked so hard to write. What if stopping means unmasking fragility, exposing parts of myself to a scrutiny I am not prepared to face? These reflections unfold in the silence between heartbeats, where courage does not roar but gently lingers, coaxing me forward. Like a fragile bloom opening with tentative hope, I feel the stirrings of trust growing. Trust that worthiness transcends the lines of productivity and that my essence can be held tenderly, even in absence of doing. Perhaps the most profound revelation lies in the realization that the tension I have carried is both universal and deeply personal. It lives in the spaces where we grapple with the impossible demand to both move and rest, to be endlessly productive, yet constantly replenished. Navigating this paradox feels like learning a new dance, one where every step echoes with significance and silence speaks volumes. The patterns we adopt shape not only how we experience time, but how we inhabit our very being. The quiet realms where fears whisper and strength quietly resides. I sense now that embracing this delicate equilibrium requires more than fleeting intentions. It calls for a gentle rewiring of the inner landscape. It asks us to witness our own edges with compassion, to welcome discomfort as a companion in transformation rather than an enemy to be silenced. This calling is not a quick fix or a simple decision. It is an ongoing practice, a daily act of courage that asks for patience, vulnerability, and unwavering kindness toward ourselves. As I navigate this unfolding story, I find myself increasingly aware of moments when tension loosens, allowing the currents beneath to carry me with a newfound ease. These spells do not erase struggle, but create spaces where integration becomes possible, where the body and mind converse in a language beyond words. It is in these spaces that I glimpse a fuller possibility, a harmony wherein rest is not suspicion but sanctuary, where patience nurtures growth as surely as effort pushes boundaries. I invite you to walk alongside me at this pivotal juncture, to feel the gentle pull of this transformation as it hums quietly between our breaths. There is a kind of rhythm emerging, one that honors the complexity of our experience and whispers of a path where acceptance and striving are not opponents but collaborators in our unfolding lives. Together, we might sense the contours of this new ground, uneven but fertile, inviting us to step lightly and boldly into what lies just beyond. I've come to understand that the hardest battles I fight aren't always visible. They're silent skirmishes inside me, where pressure tangles with longing and the pull to move collides with the craving to simply be. For years, I mistook pace for purpose, believing that only through endless doing could I prove my place in the world. But as I inch closer to an unfamiliar ease, I see how profoundly misguided this belief was. Life doesn't demand ceaseless motion. It asks for presence, deep, raw, unapologetic presence that honors every shade of our humanity. One evening, I found myself outside beneath a spread of stars, cool night air brushing my face. The sky stretched infinitely, dotted with ancient fires burning steady, untouched by urgency. In that vastness, I felt a whisper of connection, not to achievement or accolades, but to enduring existence itself. It was humbling and freeing, as if the cosmos were inviting me to shed the weight of relentless striving and remember something vital. Meaning isn't forged solely through action, but through allowing moments to unfold exactly as they are, without insisting on their utility. Walking back home, I realized how much of my energy was stifled by an unrelenting voice insisting I earn my space by being productive. It struck me that this inner dialogue was less an ally and more a relentless guard keeping me imprisoned. The walls of that captivity are fortified by fear, the fear of quiet judgment, of appearing empty, of losing control. Yet, in acknowledging this, I glimpsed a paradoxical power, the freedom to loosen the grip, to invite softness in even when it feels unnatural, and to begin cultivating a relationship with myself based on trust instead of punishment. I remember sitting on my porch one afternoon, hands wrapped around a warm mug, feeling a gentle breeze tease the edges of my mind. Instead of filling the silence with self-recriminations or mental to-do lists, I focused on the simple fact of breathing, slow, deliberate breaths filling my lungs and exiting without hurry. That small act felt revolutionary, almost defiant against years of conditioned urgency. It was a moment where I tasted liberation, a glimpse of a life where worth isn't measured by output, but by the depth of my presence and acceptance. The truth I hold now is layered and complex. Anxiety has legacies that run deep, intertwining with identity, safety, and belonging. Untangling these threads requires patience and compassion, not haste or self-criticism. I've learned that embracing vulnerability in these still places isn't weakness. It's an act of courage that rewrites the patterns locked in my body and mind. This courage invites softness into hardened spaces and liberates energy that was trapped in cycles of perfectionism and relentless doing. I want to offer you an invitation, not a demand or quick fix, but a gentle call to experiment with presence that honors every shade of your experience. When the urge to prove yourself rages, lean into the sensations without battling. Observe what arises, hold it kindly, and trust that your value doesn't hinge on constant output or visible results. Imagine your life as an unfolding landscape where motion and pause sculpt the contours of your unique journey, each moment a brushstroke adding richness to the whole. As I walk alongside these discoveries, I realize this transformation is ongoing. It does not erase old fears or expectations overnight, but gradually softens them, creating room for belonging without conditions. It transforms the places where despair once nested into welcoming sanctuaries where renewal takes root. Through this process, I reclaim ownership of my experience, not by forcing change, but by embracing what is with open hands and a tender heart. If you recognize these struggles in your own reflection, know you are far from alone. Many of us carry these hidden weights, whispering stories that bind us to hustle and guilt. But within those shadows exists a spark, no matter how faint, that can ignite a new story, one that honors wholeness and allows thriving not through constant action, but through mindful being. In the end, I hold close this truth. Living fully means blending tenacity with gentleness, ambition with acceptance, striving with surrender. The most profound vitality often blooms in these delicate balances, where we invite ourselves to move courageously and pause unapologetically, weaving an existence that is rich, sustaining, and real. This is not the easy path, but it is the one where freedom quietly waits, ready to unfold when we are brave enough to receive it.